Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So I'm Sarah Chambers, the chair of the history department here at the university, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to another iteration of the History Book Club. We have started the fall semester now, and we started out the fall semester with it feeling very much like summer. But now, right with the equinox, the switch turned, and now the air is crisp and the leaves are just starting to turn color, and we're able to go out and get sweet tango and Honeycrisp apples. And so it really does feel like fall. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to, the book club, to welcome back alumni, to feature current faculty and the excellent work that they are publishing and interesting research that we're doing. We'll have a short presentation on today's book and then a conversation between Adam Blackler and Eric Rubinek, and then there will be time for you to ask questions. I will ask that you type them into the chat, and then I will come in towards the end of our hour and read those questions and get answers to them. Clayton Smith is here to run things in the background and jump in should anything go wrong with the technical difficulties, but we haven't had any recently, so I think we will be absolutely fine. So it's really a pleasure to welcome Adam Blackler, who got his PhD here in 2017 when I was serving as DGS, so that's a nice treat for me. He's currently assistant professor at the University of Wyoming, and his book here is just hot off the presses, so much so that he had to share with me page proofs because it really just came out this week. Do you want to hold it up, Adam, so we can see it actually is a physical book? But
I was prepared.
We're really excited. It's like the world premiere here at the University of Minnesota Book Club, History Book Club, so that we get to talk about this really fascinating book. And Adam's book and Eric Rubinek's work, who was his peer here and also in German history, but both of them represent one of the real strengths of our program, which is encouraging faculty and students to think across traditional geographic divides, to think transnationally, to interrogate colonialism and what that means. And so looking really forward to their conversation, since Adam's work is looking at this from an early period of German imperialism in Africa, and I understand that Eric is now working on it from a later period in the era of World War II and sort of Italian and German fascism and how that is interacting with Africa. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn things over to Adam to get a little bit of a presentation about the book and then start the conversation with Eric.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Clayton. Thank you, Ann Waltner, who I know was one of the chief originators of this program when you took over as chair. I thank all of you for this. And if I may say, Sarah, I won't go too far down the road here, but you mentioned Eric and I are peers. There was a joke, an inside joke many years ago, where a colleague of ours in Europe referred to Eric as my mentor. So I am very pleased to see that I have graduated to a peer now, and I knew he knew where I was going. And without belaboring this much more, I also think it is incredibly important for me to at least say, for a number of reasons. I want to acknowledge, of course, Gary Cohen, who was my co-advisor. I don't know if he is here this evening, but he had an instrumental role both in this project, both as a dissertation and then eventually when it became a book manuscript. And then, of course, Eric Weitz. And I think I would be remiss to not mention him here, passing in a very untimely manner 2 years ago. He was an excellent advisor. He had a deep impact on this work. And I think it's appropriate to mention him, obviously, because of his connection with the University of Minnesota. But in the context of this evening, I was his last advisor, or his final advisee at Minnesota, and Eric Rubenek was his second to last advisee. So I just want to acknowledge that. And Eric, would you like to say anything? You're good. Okay. He had a deep impact for both of us. So just to acknowledge that. So if to invoke Eric, he would say, get to the text. So I'm going to get to the text. So with that, I would like to spend just a little bit of time going over the essence of the book. And then as I hope all of you who know me well would expect, I'm very interested in a conversation. So I would like to limit my voice here and really get to our discussion. So without further ado, I will share my screen. And here we go. My book, An Imperial Homeland, Forging German Identity in Southwest Africa, ultimately seeks to reorient our understanding of the relationship between Imperial Germany and its empire in Southwest Africa, specifically the state of Namibia today. And it attempts to accomplish this goal in a number of ways, but among them is its emphasis on what I refer to as colonial encounters. And this is something I will define far more carefully in a second. But through this emphasis on colonial encounters, this book exposes the other side of imperial occupation, specifically how, in this case, Black Africans confronted white foreign rule and the degree to which transnational entanglements, and that could of course take many iterations, altered German identity, both in the colony itself as well as in the metropole. And I think the significance of this focus really opens up a whole score of opportunities. Eric and I were having a conversation a little bit ago talking about some of the really formative and important literature that this book was able to build upon. And I was very aware of this historiographically. So in this context, while I hope it accomplishes, or this book is significant for a number of reasons, in my opinion, there are really two things that makes it significant, if you will, that address the so what question. The first of which, this book discusses and or shows the colonial experience, in this case, Germany's colonial experience, in a much longer time span. Specifically, it shows how colonialism affected German society over a time period that, for the most part, is something that is not discussed until very much in the recent historiographical literature. German colonialism as a formal project began in 1884. This book, one could argue, goes to the end of the 18th century, but for the most part really formally begins with the beginning of the Wohlmats in 1815 and up until 1948. So a much longer time span. And I think this is significant because in talking about this much events and moments in this much longer time span, it allows us to show how the pre-colonial as well as the pre-unification period in German history had a direct impact and a direct influence on the formal colonial and the post-unification period in German history. So I'm very much tying together these two, I would argue, interrelated narratives, nationalism and colonialism, and extending that study during a much longer span. Secondly, and I think perhaps most importantly, not to create a false hierarchy, but most importantly, in showing and emphasizing colonial encounters, it allows me to demonstrate the significant power and consequence of Africans themselves in Germany's colonial history, an inherently violent project to be sure, and I will be the first to absolutely admit this is a German history first and foremost, but it is my fundamental belief that any German history that takes on the colonial experience should endeavor to be holistic in its presentation. And in demonstrating the voice and the actions, and in this case, primarily the resistance of African populations themselves, this book is able to demonstrate that that Africans were not a static, monolithic population that did nothing but serve as victims in a larger colonial project, in a larger history of domination. They resisted, they were very successful in a lot of these resistance campaigns. And in fact, in that resistance, and this is what really gets into the book, In their successful campaigns of resistance, they unfortunately transform, through no fault of their own, the project into an even more violent occupation. And I think showing that over a long time span really demonstrates the significance of this history. So that's the big emphasis of the book. Now, something that I think is very important to emphasize. Namibia, in this case, Southwest Africa, was not, of course, Germany's only colony. It was its first colony, formally colonized in 1884, but as I say, certainly not its only one. The so-called German East Africa, parts of what is today Western Africa, Togo, etc., parts of various archipelagos in the Pacific Ocean, even parts of present-day China. Germany had, actually, territorially speaking, the third largest empire at the turn of the 20th century. Of course, third only to, in this case, the British Empire and the French Empire. So the obvious question might be, why Namibia? Well, it was the first, which I think is an important thing that I get into in the book. But far more importantly for this discussion, it was Germany's first and only settlement colony. And it evolved into that very inherently violent status in 1894 with the formal decree that was passed by the German government. And the essence of a settler colonial project, as I know many people in the audience themselves are scholars that actually focus on settler colonialism in a variety of contexts, I think it is very fair to say that it is at minimum potentially, and in all likely, inherently genocidal. It is obviously a project that seeks to replace one or multiple groups with a culture and a presence of another. And in this case, that is absolutely what starts to happen at the turn of the 20th century in Namibia. So in terms of talking about colonialism and nationalism in this German context, this is a very, if I will, obvious choice to make. But the histories in this space are also so incredibly rich. It will also demonstrate how Namibia had a direct impact on other colonial colonies in Germany's imperial project as well. And that's something I really very much conclude with in the book. Very briefly, I will not do a chapter by chapter rundown, but just to give people a sense, there are 6 chapters in this book, and I have very purposely focused on thematic elements in each of the chapters, but it is also a book that is laid out in a chronological format. It's chronological. The first 2 chapters focus on the pre-colonial and pre-unification periods of German history, and also in this case in Namibia. So a focus on missionaries, missionary societies, specifically the Rhenish Mission Society, but also anybody that fancies themselves as adventurers, as explorers, as adventure capitalists, whole scores of people. The 3rd and 4th chapters are dedicated to the formal period of German colonial occupation of Namibia. So 1884 to roughly the turn of the century. So a focus on, again, everything from settlers to in some cases missionaries, but a formal colonial establishment, as well as Africans themselves, an entire focus on it's a very diverse, very ethnically diverse country, demonstrating how these individuals contrasted and conflicted with the colonial empire. And then finally, the 3rd part of the book, chapters 5 and 6, demonstrate how the colonial project, while always an inherently violent thing, became an even more intrinsically violent campaign in the aftermath of what I would refer to as the first genocide of the 20th century, the Herero Nama genocide, which occurred from 1904 to 1907. And the specific consequences that has in Namibia, of course, first and foremost on populations themselves, but then how Germans start to think of themselves in a much broader standpoint, even in the metropole. Okay, as I said, the way I'm able to do all of this, I hope successfully, is with a focus or through a focus on colonial encounters. And I define colonial encounters, admittedly here somewhat broadly, but in the following way. I define colonial encounters as the formal occasions when Germans and Africans interacted with one another, specifically through treaty negotiations, trade networks, as well as military conflict. But in addition to that, and perhaps most importantly, these encounters also comprised informal points of contact, specifically those that correspondence, newspapers, missionary reports, and travel literature, in addition to scores of other things, generated in German and international media markets. And in focusing on colonial encounters, and this is one of the things I'm most proud of in this project, I really think I'm able to demonstrate how a very far away colony genuinely did have an impact in everyday life for people that the overwhelming majority of whom never actually go overseas, much less in some cases never even move out or move away from their small little dorf. And so this is something where I'm really able to bring both formal and informal together. I'm using this background here as an example of this, one of scores that I talk about in the book. This is actually an image facsimile of a board game that was incredibly popular. It came out in 1897 and became very popular in the buildup to the First World War in Germany, that was simply called Germany's Colony Game. And it was in this way that in this case, companies, but certain colonial enthusiasts were able to say, colonialism is something that you could experience and understand, and really should experience and understand, but you could also do it, in this case, as predominantly children, in the safe confines of your living room, be it in Berlin or be it in Mannheim. And so it exposes children in this case to, in a scores, hosts of ways. And this would also be something that I would refer to specifically as an informal encounter, all right? Another example of a formal encounter, one of many I talk about in the book, in this case, a very vehemently racist and violent one. And I want to emphasize Germany was not unique to this, by the way, but these so-called Volksschuen or human exhibitions, human zoos that emerge in places like Treptow-Park. This particular one, this is a postcard that is advertising this human zoo, and in this case, this colonial exhibition that will take place, or that took place, in 1896 in Treptow-Park. This attracted over 1 million visitors over 6 months, just this one specific exhibit alone. And in focusing on this, as I say, this is one of many ways I'm able to emphasize that people who do not go overseas in their minds are still experiencing and encountering the empire, again, even though it's very much one in this framed way. But they're in this case able to either confirm or evolve in how they think of the colonial experience. A formal example, a formal colonial encounter, would be like those that happen in Namibia itself. And in this case, in this particular example, that would showcase a Hendrik Witbooi. Hendrik Witbooi is somebody that I've written a lot about over the last couple of years. If anybody has ever been to Namibia before, you would actually recognize him. He's a prominent figure on Namibian currency today. And in particular, because he is considered to be one of Namibia's founding fathers. And in this case, he fought very successfully the German government, the German colonial government, from the minute they arrived in 1884, all the way until he died in 1905. This resistance that he puts up happens in a myriad of ways. Military, diplomatic, he reaches out to foreign governments, the British, the Union of South Africa, and he's very successful in not only confronting German colonial rule, but in particular in confronting German rule, getting people in the metropole to actually acknowledge his presence, but to realize that their colonial fantasies that they showed up with in Namibia were complete fallacies. And in doing that, it really again showcases how Africans have a very central role in this history, something that I know a lot of scholars in the global South would of course say, and would say there's nothing new about this. One of the things I want to emphasize here is try and get to audiences that maybe up until very recently might not be as aware of this history. So a more holistic portrayal. And so this focus on Hendrik Witbooi and the way he's able to demonstrate his successful resistance, though was never his intention, unfortunately speaks to why I argue in the book, Germany's colonial project in Namibia becomes increasingly violent. Again, I want to underscore, it was violent from the beginning. Racism was a part of this from the beginning. Civilizational worldviews were present from the beginning. But when Africans upset the facade of German colonial fantasy through these encounters, increasingly more and more Germans started to justify their presence in Namibia through increasingly physical and juridical acts of violence. The most infamous of which, of course, would be the Herero Nama genocide. And this is one of the many images from that horrific act of violence in 1905. But what's also significant about this is it further demonstrates how this colonial project evolved in this way, specifically because they were proven to be incorrect. Their civilizational worldview was really turned on its head. And so while this horrific violence is a very unfortunate, and that's a very big understatement, element of this history, one of the things I think is so important that I do in this book is in showcasing it this way, is the same genocidal potentials that were present in Namibia and ultimately were unleashed in 1904. These were the same ones that were present in every colonial empire. Thankfully, genocides in the same specific way didn't happen in a lot of these other colonies. Of course, segregation, annihilatory violence in many ways occurred, but they were present everywhere. And if you understand that, then Germany's colonial project not only becomes even more important for historians and scholars to understand, but it also demonstrates that it was not unique, at least the conditions that made it possible. All right. I will conclude with this. One of the reasons this also then becomes really important is in the immediate aftermath of the genocide. It further demonstrates how the colonial society was structured and really becomes this heavily segregationist society. It demonstrates how Germans in the metropole increasingly started to think of Namibia, in this case, Southwest Africa, as a foreign extension of their empire. And in thinking of it both territorially and culturally that way, they also started to incorporate settlers themselves into their notions of what it means to be German. And you get scores of petitions, like the background of this suggests, Germans writing about themselves as ideal settlers, and in doing so also demonstrating that that's how they think all German, in this case German men, white German men, should operate within this empire. So this is one of the myriad of ways that showcases the significance and consequence of colonialism. And I very much look forward to a discussion in the remaining time that we have left. Thank you very much.
I think I found my mouse. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam, for inviting me. Thank you, Sarah and Clayton, the University of Minnesota, for inviting me to do this comment. I hope you don't regret it. It's great to see some familiar faces, and you know the antics I'm probably up to. Part of Adam's introduction here was to thank the people who made this possible, who had a great influence on his work, Gary Cohen, many others, and especially Eric Weitz. And I want to say I just don't see his touch here, Adam. I mean, he was interested in the colonies and Namibia, etc. But I mean, where are the wild, feather-ruffling, boat-shaking claims, right? It's not like you write in the introduction that the evolution of Heimat between the start of the formats and the conclusion of World War I was principally the result of colonial encounters. I can't see Eric's,
I am my advisor's advisee, Dr. Rubenek.
Good. What I want to say is Adam's new book, in Imperial Homeland, clearly shows the benefits of over 2 decades of renewed scholarly interest in Germany's overseas empire. His search to bring the periphery back to the metropole smacks of Frederick Cooper, Laura Ann Stoller, to say nothing of Arendt, Sartre, Césaire, Fanon, whose influence all show through here. The contributions of his book, right, namely his attempts to expand German colonialism over a longer time period, considering those pre-colonial eras, as well as his emphasis on Africans as central protagonists in German's history, all these claims are benefited, right, by some of these more specialized studies that have taken place in the last 20 years. What I want to say, though, is as I was reading this, right as chapters started to feel familiar, feel like I had heard this argument somewhere before, what I noticed is that I was reading actually completely new voices, completely new cases, completely new frameworks of putting this together. And I think here, this incorporation of new voices, of new frameworks, and of new connections is what makes this such an exciting new book on German colonialism, and especially German Southwest Africa. And it's one that you should all read. Let me repeat that. You should read it. You should buy it. It's good. And I want to be clear about my endorsement here, because in the dialogue that follows, I'm going to poke Adam pretty hard. Mostly so that he can demonstrate the novelty of it and how good it is. And also, honestly, because it's a lot of fun, right? Especially now that he's my peer. He knew what he was going to get when he invited me to do this. Now, Adam, since we both studied German colonialism from a different time period, right, from a different aspect, but we've been on the job market, we've presented this information to other people, right, scholars, lay folk, right, who don't know anything about German colonialism. I assume, like many people sitting in on this Zoom call.
Yeah.
So let me start with a question that might be familiar to you, but maybe is burning on the minds of some folks in the audience. And that's a question of significance. So I'm just going to come out swinging. Did the German colonies really matter? I mean, German colonial history was shorter than all other European colonial powers. And as you note, during the height of Germany's overseas empire in 1914, fewer than 20,000 Germans petitioned to go to German Southwest Africa. If, as you contend, that Germans abroad had an influence on German nationalism and ideas of Heimat in the metropole, would it not be more worth telling the story of Germans who emigrated by the millions to North America?
That's a big question, Eric, and I think it's something that I think is a very important series of topics to engage with. Let me start with the first one. Yes, it does matter, and it is not something that, and I think it's a fair question. It's not something that I mean to be just offer and blithely move on. I think if you mention the scope and the time period of German colonialism, first and foremost, I think if we only talk about empires in this case, or if we focus only on how we define importance, time period, territorial expanse. If that's the case, Germany's colonial empire lasted longer than East Berlin after the construction of the Berlin Wall, and that you certainly know the extensive libraries that exist on that time period alone. So I think that's something we shouldn't just limit ourselves to. But one of the many ways I think I demonstrate in this book the importance of colonialism is the evolution of the colonial, in this case, the colonial state of Namibia itself. It was a fantasy of scores of people, and this is why I focus on the long, if you will, the longue durée of German colonialism. It was a focus of so many people for so long, but a majority of them thought of it as an economic boon or something that they could capitalize on even in the mid-19th century. But when you talk about how the state and how people think about it changes in even barely a 50-year period of time, you begin to see how people think, in this case, people in Namibia and people in the metropole, start to shift the significance of the colonial experience. So in other words, it's not simply just an economic outcome. It's not something that might make an opportunity for a religious society, Protestant, Catholic, and otherwise. It's something that is a formal national extension of the state. And part of the reason, even though, again, as you say, ultimately just a little over 20,000 people end up going and settling in Namibia, tens of thousands of more will actually petition to try to. All of that starts to happen after the turn of the 20th century. There are scores of things that happen that would potentially suggest that. In the case of my book, I'm signifying that there's a racial element that people start to make. Whiteness and white Germanness is in need of defense in Namibia. But more importantly, a colonial empire, in this case in Namibia, gives Germans a place to go if they have a really bad living situation in, let's say, a Berlin or in an Essen or in a Mannheim, a place that is not necessarily, with all respect to people that live in those places today, I love each and every one of them, but places that maybe are a little more industrial. You might aspire to have more a backyard. If you are in this case, I want to be careful, I don't want to romanticize this too much, but if you are a white German woman, you might suddenly find more opportunities in a colonial sphere where you are, though still very much a patriarchal space, you might have more opportunity because white German men are forced to give you those opportunities because there are simply fewer of you, women and men. And so it presents opportunities for more people, but it's within the national framework. And I think that evolution is the importance that I show in this book.
So it's not Minnesota.
It's not Minnesota, with all respect again to Minnesota, and I know your alma mater in Wisconsin, your at least undergrad alma mater. That's the key thing. These diasporas are important, but in many respects, these same individuals I'm talking about would look to them and actually go so far as to define them as cultural fertilizer. We've lost them. Who's benefiting from that? In this case, the United States, or wherever else they may go.
Very good. Very good. I have another question kind of about your approach to this topic, right? Not just about the people or its importance, but the scope. And you've chosen here to really focus on German Southwest Africa, and you've explained how it is different because of its nature as a settler colony. It's not only Germany's first overseas colony, but it's really the only settler colony. And I wanted to know if there's anything beyond that that makes German Southwest Africa special. I mean, you talk about the ways in which this colonial extension of the state, the people who go there, the boomerang effect, right, the growing connection. Don't people also read about, for example, in the media through literature, the experiences of Germans in, say, what becomes Tanzania, German East Africa, or Cameroon or Togo? How do you differentiate the particulars, I guess, of German Southwest Africa?
Very good question. And I would say this, when Namibia formally becomes a colony, it's barely a year before, as you said, rightly, Tanzania and parts of Kenya and several other countries will become a part of this German East Africa. That happens only 6 months later. And there's a score of other colonies in Africa that will become a part of this project before the end of the 20th century. I think in the early period, there were more similarities than what happens later, all right? And what I really mean by that is the same individuals that go to Namibia are also the same ones that are going to Tanzania. Karl Peters becomes this categorized as this adventurist, a very violent, brutal man in every respect. He ends up establishing what comes to be known as the German East Africa Company, and it's effectively a monopoly. There are people that do the same thing in Namibia in 1885 as well, the German Southwest Africa Company. So there are a lot of similarities. The element of settler colonialism, in my opinion, is what becomes the single most important aspect here. Because in this sense, scores of people, several thousand people, in fact, slightly more than 20,000 as well, will eventually settle in East Africa too. It never has that distinction. They are there for, in their minds at least, very significantly different purposes. Namibia becomes I don't mean this hierarchically or civilizationally, but a peripheral element that is an otherwise Germany abroad. And that happens specifically because of the people that go there over the course of 1884 to the turn of the century, but also how they write about the space, the fact that Bettman Holweg will designate, Chancellor Bettman Holweg will designate German Southwest Africa as a settlement colony. That distinction in of itself elevates the significance and the importance of it to nationalists, pan-Germanists, again, increasingly those that look to Germanists through a white prism, a whiteness prism. And in that respect then, in this element as a settler colony, it then will increasingly become in Germany itself, the entity that everybody in Germany that supports colonialism thinks of when they think of the colonial sphere in general. So you see some of these really horrific generalizations about what it must mean to live in the colony. And more often than not, those generalisms are based on Namibia. And so that's where you see the growing importance and place of Namibia, even in this fantastic, again, hierarchical mindset. But Namibia is nevertheless the center for all of these individuals. And it's because of its role as a settlement colony.
Part of it seems to me, is that because it's a settlement colony leads to this horrific event that is the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples. At the time, though, right, this isn't considered a genocide, not to diminish the violence, right? But the language being used, the language being reported at home is basically one of a rebellion, the Herero Aufstand. Just within months in German East Africa, there's a Maji-Maji Aufstand, right? A Maji-Maji rebellion. In what ways if you're considering how these ideas are reported back home, right, and the influence they're having on an understanding of German nationality, was this as significant, or was the Maji-Maji rebellion less significant in a formation of German nationalism at home, do you think?
I don't think that any one event genocidal in this way is any less significant than the other. I think it actually, and I know you of course don't mean it this way. Every element of German colonialism, any colonialism, is inherently genocidal, or excuse me, inherently violent and potentially genocidal. And I think that's not necessarily dangerous ground upon which to stand. But in the case in German history, and I know this is something you deal with a lot considering your research, I think we're on very shaky ground if we start demonstrating special paths, shall we say, Sonderweg, in the context of German history. The reason why the so-called Herero Aufstand, Herero Rebellion, I think is discussed, at least contemporarily in Germany, in a far more vitriolic manner in nationalist presses and in colonial presses, is particularly because, and this is one of the main elements of the book, there was a long history of successful resistance that a lot of settlers and metropolitans, I argue, were simply tired of dealing with, and that it is, of course, more complicated than the way I'm presenting it here. The human consequences are far more extensive than the way, I don't mean to be flippant at all. But I think that really speaks to the fact that by 1904, Germans and German settlers had known nothing but 20 years worth of having their fantasies basically turned back in their face. German colonists had to rent land from Black Africans. They had to rent cattle from Black Africans. They of course represented a very small minority of the population itself, but they were living in this paradoxical colonial situation where they were effectively, from an economic standpoint, subservient to the very people they were supposedly colonizing. And so as a result of that, there were scores of German administrators that attempted to improve that situation, according to the language they would use, improve that situation, but through more tempered policies. And I don't, again, racist for sure. But that, if you will, cumulative process angered an increasing number of white German settlers that wanted everything right away. And so by 1904, an increasing number of white German settlers wanted land immediately and were willing to do anything they possibly could to get it. The so-called Herero Aufstand gave them that excuse. And shortly thereafter, Germans go from controlling, roughly speaking, 5 to 10% of all territory to over 85%. And I want to emphasize, by the way, many of these same families and their descendants still control this land. And I suspect this is something we might get into later. The legacy of colonialism is very apparent today.
I'm very aware of the time, unfortunately, and I have so many more questions to ask. But since we started talking about genocide, at least mentioned it, I'm going to have one more question and then pass it back to Sarah. And that is, as I was reading this, I have to say that I found it refreshing to read a bit about German history, especially German colonial history, without an explicit connection or address to Nazism. Mm-hmm. Only briefly, I think, in your introduction, do you mention the colonial literature that some might argue as of late has been mired in a new continuity debate over German peculiarities, right? A new positing of a Windhoek to Auschwitz kind of thesis. Mm-hmm. So thank you for not doing that. There is, however, a more recent debate in Germany and among historians of Germany over the last couple of years that we might call the Historikerstreit 2.0, or the second historians debate. Mm-hmm. Basic arguments pit or posit that the violent colonial past of Germany is incomparable to, if not incompatible with, a national remembrance of Germany's violent past in perpetrating the Holocaust. How do you think your work, how would you situate it within this growing controversy?
A massively important question, and I know, and I'm not just saying this to be agreeable, I know this is something that you have been actually very engaged with in a variety of circles, and I don't want to announce anything on your behalf, but I know you've been working on this. My work explicitly deals with this, I think, in the sense that I am making the argument, and again, this is going to sound rather simplistic, that colonialism mattered in German history, both contemporarily, but also up to the present day. And I think one of the ways I think my work really contributes to some of the legacies of this is, for instance, the impact that German colonialism is having in everything from the Humboldt Forum and the tremendous controversies that are apparent there, all the way to, in this case, the former German colony of Namibia. Scores of questions about, as you know, finally, a year and a half ago, Germany finally, it's actually a year ago now, Germany finally admitted this was a genocide. They acknowledged it, but only after some very intense negotiations that an admittance of genocide wouldn't lead to reparations. And now that is something that's even being negotiated. And the Namibian state is something that is a little more keen, the government is a little more keen to accept it, but not Horero, not Overhero, not Nama, not San, not others. So there's these interstate, dynamics as a part of this as well. All of this is to say, this work contributes to those discussions. The Historische Streit sei kommen null. I think in terms of my work, I'm not doing this to, again, be agreeable to both sides. I think there are elements that, if you allow me to generalize and say there are only two sides in this discussion, I think there are elements that would find some appeal in elements of this project. As I know this is a position you harbor as well, the dangerous potentials that made the Namibian genocide a possibility, of course, were present in, of course, the Holocaust. But I think it would be a very simplistic narrative to simply say that they are teleologically connected too. And this is not a shot at any single scholar or group of scholars. I think the incredibly important work that has been done the last 20 years that emphasizes these violent connections, you and I and many others are beneficiaries of. But I also think if we only focus on the violence here and its connection to the Holocaust, we are de-emphasizing the significance of African peoples themselves and the pre-colonial period and the formative colonial period. And we're doing nothing other than relegating them as a footnote to the so-called Kaiser's Holocaust. And I think that's partially what the debate is about, of course, among scores of other things. So much to discuss there, Eric. And I'm looking forward to engaging in that as it evolves over undoubtedly the next months and years.
Yeah, great questions back and forth and answers. And I want to echo Eric's endorsement of this really interesting book. I learned so much as someone who studies a different earlier colonialism of Spain in the Americas. It was really interesting for me. And I think, we're historians, so the timing and the chronology is so important, and the sort of coming together of a moment of German unification and nationalism with this imperialism gives it a much different flavor, that the sort of Heimat or homeland or patria in the case of the language I deal with, it's much fuzzier, in an earlier period where people have loyalties to different kingdoms and different, so very interesting. And so we have some questions coming into the chat. Elizabeth Williams congratulates you, Adam, and asks, could you talk a little bit about how the project changed as you revised the dissertation into a book?
Absolutely. Thank you, my dear friend Elizabeth. It is great to see you virtually out there. And I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail beyond this conversation. It evolved in, I think the structure, Elizabeth, of this project has very much remained the same, the core, if you will. I'm trying to emphasize African voices in what admittedly is, again, another otherwise German history, and to demonstrate how resistance transformed this project over a long time period. But specifically, I was fortunately able I was very fortunate to get a job right as I was finishing my dissertation, and then got a different job, the one I currently have. And I was fortunate to continue this research. And so I was able to add 2 additional chapters, both of which actually, I think, frankly, are in my opinion, the most important. And I think maybe the most innovative. I hope this last chapter, for instance, on the transformation of German masculinity in a colonial and national sphere. And that came from doing some archival research, but also, if I may, taking the time to sit down to think about how this could be a significant book that speaks to wide scores of people within various academic disciplines, and does not necessarily serve as a piece that is trying to demonstrate my qualifications for a degree. And that is not meant to be patronizing in any way. In other words, focus on the flow, the language, how this is addressing a significant argument, as opposed to showcasing where I fit in with the historiography. And it was something that, of course, took some time. And I must, again, I leaned very heavily on a core group of colleagues and friends, among them former advisors, people like Eric Rubinek and like you yourself, Elizabeth. So thank you. I hope I addressed that, and I'm happy to go into more detail at any time in the future.
We have a couple questions in the chat, Adam, that want to have you talk a little bit more, because you emphasize how important it is to not lose sight of African subjectivity.
Yes.
And that, you know, one of the risks of just jumping quickly from the violence of colonialism to the Holocaust is to lose sight of that. So can you give some more specific examples of what were the forms of resistance by Africans to German colonialism on the one hand, and then also how did those actions have an impact back in the metropole in Deutschland?
Absolutely. I won't just be a broken record here, but I'll mention Hendrik Witbooi, and then there's a couple others. Hendrik Witbooi is a great example of this. He is somebody that will refuse to work with any German colonists during, roughly speaking, the first 8 or so years after an official government arrives. Why? Because these German colonists have no ability to control him. They have no way of actually forcing him to do anything. And so a type of resistance would be simply not agreeing to meet with them, writing very terse, very it's delightful to read some of these accounts. Terse, dismissive, like, who are you to talk to me? He goes so far as to say, I am the chief of this particular region, the paramount leader in some cases of these communities in southern Namibia. You have no voice here. The reason he's able to communicate this in very clear language is he had actually been trained during his adolescence in a German mission school, which I talk about in a part of the earlier part of the book. So he knew German fluently, he knew Afrikaans fluently, so he could speak with a lot of people, and as a result write these very, very colorful, shall we say, letters. So that, engaging in their own language, being a very devout Christian. So basically throwing their notions of, in this case, religious enlightenment back in their face and say, well, this is not what a Christian would do. We should be able to govern our own societies and follow God in our own way. So advocating the hypocrisy of the German government. But then he was a very shrewd and very capable military commander. So demonstrating that they're not going to have it their way. Samuel Maharero is another figure, the leader of another one of many Ovaherero communities, will initially seem like he's cooperating with the German government, but for his own reasons. He's doing it because he's trying to get more regional control among other African communities that are kind of fighting with him for control of northern Namibia. So the Germans are a tool, not the other way around. And so there's scores of others. Nicodemus Cavaquinha, a group a person you don't really hear about all that much. There are scores of women that I'm actually I wish I could have gotten access to some of these sources. I still very much admit this is kind of a top-down perspective, even from the African voices here. At least to a degree, a lot of leaders, but in this focus, really showcasing you can't have it your way. And then back to Sarah's, the way she was able to really nicely bring these questions together. Germans back home read about this. This is not the glorious thing that it was supposed to be. This is not the cheap thing that it was supposed to be. Namibia is not paying for itself, everybody. This is not something that is making everyone rich and bountiful. And increasingly, they now have to justify, if we're going to have this as a part of Germany, we now have to find new ways to justify it. And the way to do that is to defend Germandom, Deutschtum, to defend race, depending on a white race in this way, of course, in quotes. One could defend Christianity, but that's a harder argument to make because a lot of Africans, again, are Christian. So this nationalism is what becomes important. And that is how you see this from again, literature, the way people talk about it in Namibia, the way people talk about it in the streets. Perhaps the most public exhibit of this, Sarah, is what I don't want to say it because it's a derogatory term, but the elections of 1907. The entire federal German election becomes about Namibia. And it's demarcated in, you're either a supporter of Black Africans and therefore quote unquote savagery. So if you're a supporter of them, vote for the SPD, vote for the other side. If you're a supporter of Germandom, you will vote for us. And that's the clearest way you see this politically, but scores of ways locally and others as well.
Mhm. Great, thanks. And actually, it was Kirsten Fisher who posed that question about
Okay.
the back. And we have another one, since you brought up the case of women. They're wondering if you can, Rebecca DeCero, if you can provide some more examples of the experiences and resistance of Arero and Nama women in German Southwest Africa.
Rebecca, an excellent student of mine here at the University of Wyoming, actually voluntarily sat in a class of mine earlier this afternoon that she's not even in. So this is the kind of student she is. So welcome, Rebecca, and all of my other students out there. Directly to your question, there's a lot, unfortunately, again, Rebecca, I don't feature a lot of when I say I don't talk about specific women at times, they are not as present in some of the sources I had. I was very fortunate to go to, for instance, I should say they weren't authors, to places in Namibia, Botswana, South Africa. I was very fortunate to do a lot of extensive research. A lot of Black African men will talk about communities, and in doing so, they do actually bring out a lot of what women will do to passively or openly resist colonialism. And I'm thinking in particular here, the most prominent examples are Ova Herero communities, among them Samuel Maharero, Nicodemus Cavaquina, Jan Janka Afrikaner, in the early parts of colonialism, German colonialism, where they will maybe not attend a mission school. They'll actively look to not learn German. There's actually efforts to get more and more Africans to speak German. So they'll resist that. The Germans will complain constantly about their lack of a work ethic. What they really mean is they're not doing the kind of work that Germans want them to do. This would be women and men in this case. At least in the formative colonial period, it was still something that was taboo in the minds of many Germans, but a blind eye was turned to settlers who married Black African women. That is radical, and so in that respect, not marrying or not consensually engaging in a relationship, if again it's even possible to have a consensual relationship in a colonial context. That becomes impossible after the Herero genocide, when it's made illegal to have that kind of thing. So there are scores of ways where this comes out, Rebecca. And the last thing I will say, some of the most prominent women in the book, and something I am proud of really getting into, are white German women that go overseas and talk about their experiences and what they would label these emancipatory occurrences they have in Namibia, and then what that means for German women back in Germany. And then also finally, Protestant German women that are equally and active voices in missionary societies in Namibia. And in fact, German women are far more successful missionaries in Namibia than German men are. There's whole scores of reasons for that, but that's where women really do come out in this book.
It's interesting because there are other examples too in which women are carrying sort of the national identity. So in this case, both German women, but you mentioned that many of these Herero and other African male leaders are in some sense effective in their forms of resistance, because they know that, they know the German language, they converted to Christianity, but then there could be this other side of it, of sort of refusing to go in that direction if the women are indeed doing that. Maybe a sort of last question here, Deborah Cohen, will sort of step back into the comparative framework. And you mentioned German is sort of by the beginning of the 20th century, the third largest European empire, colonial power. She's wondering, in comparing it to England and France, did England and France take something, learn something from German colonialism, borrow any of the strategies or policies, apply lessons of German imperialism? So they were already out there. They were not new to the game, but were they also influenced by German policies in the empire?
Yeah, another radically important question, and the answer again, and there's tons to say, but yes, and it happens both ways. Perhaps a very violent example. Again, most of these unfortunately are. It is the British and the Spanish, of course, that will invent the concentration camp. We rightly so think of Germans in concentration camps and in forced labor camps in a German context. But these happened, you know, in what will be at the time was the Cape Colony and the Union of South Africa, but eventually then becomes South Africa. Germans in Namibia will learn this strategy, if you could call it that, and will employ it with horrific, violent consequences in 1904 and subsequently thereafter. The British and the French will bend over backwards to, especially after the First World War, to try and say, no, we were very different. We were very peaceful in comparison to the German project. But one of the things I would say, there of course are differences in if, you know, I don't know if Patricia Lorsan is here, she would be one of many that of course could really get into the specifics of the British and the French and other empires in addition to others. But in particular, depending on the settlement colonies that the British and the French will have individually, the notion of segregation, the notion of so-called anti-miscegenation laws, there's scores of correspondence that colonial officials will share with one another, specifically in South Africa in this case. Another empire I would bring up, non-European, would be the United States. The United States, 100%, yeah, as I was just saying it, Eric. The United States is something that will be where I am currently speaking to all of you from, Wyoming, is an unfortunate, horrific example of the consequences of settler colonialism. And Carl Dernberg was in frequent contact with scores of people in what is now the Trans-Mississippi West, Wyoming, et cetera, and not only trying to give advice on how to colonize passively or successfully, but also took in the experiences of colonists in the United States and incorporated them in Namibia. I have scores of references in the book that actually talk about the United States as a great example of what we could follow and how we could do this peacefully, and one that might not necessarily involve massacres by bullets, for example. So these empires are in constant contact. We don't hear a lot about that because one of the at least a lot until recently, because after World War I, the justification that the British and French will give to stripping Germany of its empire is that they were inherently violent and we're not. And so that's where the narrative really tries to demarcate the differences, even though there really weren't any.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to formally end our discussion. I really want to thank Adam for sharing this, as I said, hot off the presses book, and Eric for posing some really important probing questions that led to a really lively conversation. Thank all of you who tuned in and put your questions into the chat to join into that conversation. The book club has been recorded, and since you signed up, you will later get a link so you can come back and revisit it and revisit book clubs you may have missed. You will get an invitation soon to the next book club. We'll be back on our Wednesday time, October 12th, with Howard Lauthan, who's a professor here in our department and director of the Center for Austrian Studies, and Jonathan Green, who's an instructor at the University of North Dakota. And they also have a hot off the presses translation of Toyer Donk, The Illustrated Epic of a Renaissance Knight. So I hope you can join us for that one. If you'd like to support future books for the book club by supporting graduate fellowships, we certainly would welcome, if you're so inclined, to contribute to the history department and the support for the graduate students who will be writing those books of the future. And I think that Clayton will put a link into the chat if you're so inclined. And then those of you who know Adam and Eric, and we'll sort of close out the formal book club, but you're invited to stay on the Zoom call if you want to just sort of unmic and have a little bit of informal conversation and reunion. So thanks again, Adam, Eric, and all of you who attended today.
Thank you all. Means a lot to be here.